Welcome, everybody. And today we will talk about walk it out, locations walkthrough, identification of hazards building materials. This session is sponsored by DGCBC. Thank you, DGC. My name is Natalie Diaz, and I am Motion Picture Safety Advisor at Actsafe. So before we start this session, I would like to first acknowledge the traditional indigenous lands that we all live and gather on today. Although this meeting is online, we still enjoy the pleasure of living and working within an indigenous territory. To highlight the importance of this acknowledgement, I urge you, following this session, to visit the Native Land digital website and search the territory on which you are located. That website is www.native-land.ca. This session is presented by Mona Sean. Mona is a certified industrial hygienist with 25 years of experience in exposure assessment, chemical review, and environmental public health, and has experience also in working in the film industry here in Canada. Mona and her team at Aura Health and Safety have conducted several research studies on artificial fog used in the film and television industry, as well as hazardous material and exposure assessment. Most recently, they have developed tools and training to assist production safety and location managers in identify hazards, material, and production building, and to help them navigate the next steps. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Mona during question times, please write them into the Q&A section, the top right corner of your screen. We will keep an eye on that, and we will present in appropriate time. If you see a question that you like, you can also vote to move the question up to the list. Without any delay, let me welcome your speaker for this session. Mona, please, over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Saturday morning, spending some time at walkthrough assessments for hazardous building materials. So I'm just going to share my screen right now. Okay. Hopefully everyone sees that. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why. Why do we want to do these walkthrough assessments to identify hazardous building materials? We'll talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities, and then we'll get into the actual common hazardous building materials, such as asbestos-containing materials, lead-containing materials, mercury, polychlorinated biphenyls, ozone depleting substances, silica mold, and we'll talk about animal hazards as well. And then I'm going to be leaving a little bit of time for Q&A too, so we can get to your questions then. So why is this important? Well, under the WorkSafe regulation, the Occupational Health and Safety regulation, we are supposed to do a hazard identification. We're supposed to do regular assessments of all workplaces to identify hazards. We should be doing walkthroughs to assess potential for exposure. And there's a requirement for hazardous materials assessment before you do any renovation or demolition. And so I know with productions, most of the time you're not doing much in the way of demolition, but you might be doing some renovation where you're actually affecting or impacting the building materials in which you want to shoot or do pre-production, those sorts of things. So just a little bit about roles and responsibilities. The owners are responsible, of course, for the lands and the buildings that they own. They technically should have some information about hazardous materials on their sites. So technically, they really should have an asbestos inventory that can be made available to any lessees. However, the reality is a lot of owners don't have this, and they also, or they may not share it readily. So in the film industry, I do know that a lot of productions will actually seek out information separately outside of the owners, because the employers are really responsible for the health and safety of their workers and their contractors at the work site. So that's usually the productions and the studios. So supervisors are responsible for instructing on safe work procedures and enforcing health and safety requirements. In terms of hazardous materials, they would have to help train or enforce those types of the type of work that needs to be done. Workers would need to know about and execute the job requirements, the health and safety requirements of the job. Consultants come in a lot of times to actually assess the hazardous building materials themselves. They usually are qualified people, meaning that they have knowledge of the hazards, including health effects and controls, and they usually have some type of credentialing, but they don't necessarily have to have that. They just they do need to have education, training, and experience in that area. Oh, sorry. So I'd like to talk about this checklist that Actsafe has, and I hope many of you are already familiar with this checklist. I know Anand is speaking to this next, so I won't take too much of his thunder, but I do want to draw your attention to this checklist because it talks about everything really about how to do a locations assessment. And I want to draw attention to this last part here, which is about hazardous materials. So it asks the question, is there, asbestos or lead or mold? Are there PCBs on site? And so that's great that the checklist asks that. But this presentation and the course that we put together, an online course we put together, really goes through how to do that. So we'll start with asbestos. We're going to go over classification and health hazards and identification of asbestos. Asbestos is actually derived from the Greek word indestructible. And this is perfect. This is a perfect description of asbestos because it really is indestructible. And in fact, one of the ways we analyze for asbestos is to burn all the stuff that's around it, like the material that's around it, so we can get to the asbestos and look at it under the microscope. So it really is indestructible. It's thermally resistant, electrically resistant. It lasts forever. I've found gaskets in the field that are intact, working, that are 60 years old. And so one of the complaints I have from people who are needing to change out their gaskets, for instance, is that they say the new gaskets, the ones that are made of neoprene and rubber and things like that, they only last, a few years, 5 years at the most, and they have to change them out. Whereas asbestos, 60 years later, they last longer than the equipment that they're put in. So anyways, they were used, asbestos then was used in everything because it was this wonder fiber. And what some people don't know is that it's actually not a man-made product. It's actually naturally occurring. It's found in veins of rock. And depending on the type of rock, there's different classifications of asbestos. So there's serpentine, which means that they look like a snake, they're sort of wiggly. And chrysotile is the most common asbestos in general. It's found in most places. Most of the products we come across will have chrysotile in them. But then there are amphiboles, which are straight needle-like fibers. And those are amosite and crystallite are the most common of the amphiboles. And then the tremolite and thopholite and the actinolite are actually mostly contaminants in things like vermiculite. And if you're not familiar with vermiculite, it's a loose fill insulation. Vermiculite itself doesn't have, it's not asbestos, but inside there's contamination from asbestos mainly because of this one mine that was the source of vermiculite in a lot of North America. So the mine was in Libby, Montana, and in the vermiculite itself, or during the mining, there was asbestos contamination, and that contamination sort of went all over the place into all the vermiculite that's used to fill things like concrete masonry unit walls. So these sort of block walls that are hollow inside, and they'd fill them with this loose fill insulation. And they would also fill like attic spaces just with the loose fill vermiculite. And you can imagine then there's asbestos contamination in those environments. So I think many of you are familiar with the hazards of asbestos already. It's a known carcinogen. There's some respiratory diseases it causes. Asbestosis is one of them. And to tell you what happens in asbestosis, I need to kind of step back a little bit and talk about what happens when you breathe in this indestructible fiber. Well, the immune cells in your lung, called macrophages, they try to encompass the fibers, but these are long fibers and they're sharp on the ends. And what happens is the macrophages get punctured a lot of times. And the macrophages have these things called lysozymes in them, these enzymes that are meant to digest things, right? But what happens is this stuff kind of leaks out into the lung itself. And then over time, you get inflammation and you get scarring of that tissue. And so then you have less and less tissue that's healthy that can have that oxygen exchange. And so then you have trouble breathing. It has a whole number of different health effects that can occur. So asbestosis is sort of that fibrosis of the lung. You can also get lung cancer. If it progresses more, you can get lung cancer. And of course, lung cancer is not just caused by asbestos. If you're a smoker, you have a much higher chance of getting lung cancer with asbestos exposure. Then there's mesothelioma, which is cancer of the lining of the lung. So somehow those fibers get outside into the lining of the lung and then cause cancer there. So these diseases have different latency periods. So with asbestosis, you can get it in a fairly short period of time, 5 to 10 years, whereas mesothelioma is on the sort of opposite side of that, where it takes 30, 40, sometimes 50 years for you to see mesothelioma, and it's oftentimes after people have already retired. So the factors that influence the potential for health effects, of course, are the same for any kind of chemical exposure. Dose, how much have you had? And then duration, how long have you had exposure? The type of asbestos fiber inhaled too. So I was telling you about the serpentine ones, the chrysotile versus the amphibole, which are the straight needle ones. In the past, when I was in school, we actually had 2 different occupational exposure limits, one for chrysotile type asbestos and then one for the amphiboles. And it was because there was this belief that the needle-like ones were a bit more toxic. But nowadays, we just treat them all with 1 occupational exposure limit. Neither of them are good for you. Individual susceptibility, I talked about already. So if you're a smoker, then you have actually a much greater chance of getting lung cancer. So it's not just additive, like if you had a 5 times, greater chance of getting lung cancer due to asbestos and like say a 10 times greater due to smoking. It's not like you have now a 15 times greater risk of getting lung cancer. You now have a 50 times. So it's a multiplicative type effect. The route of exposure, of course, in asbestos exposure is important. Mostly it's inhalation that we're concerned with, but there are effects with the skin. So if you get a lot of asbestos on your skin, you can get dermatitis and it's uncomfortable as well. There have been instances of people ingesting asbestos in their drinking water and then having some outcomes there. There's mesothelioma that has been shown with people ingesting fibers, which is interesting. So how do we identify asbestos? In BC, we define it as being 0.5% or greater asbestos in a material. And that's considered an asbestos-containing material. Other jurisdictions have different percentages, different definitions. And actually, even in the past, before 2012 in BC, we defined asbestos-containing materials as 1%. And in the States, they define it as 1%. So it depends on what jurisdiction you're in, which then becomes important because if you're importing things from other places, they might say it's asbestos-free, but doesn't meet your definition or our definition of asbestos-free. So there's thousands and thousands of products that contain asbestos, and this is just a short list of them. In fact, it's easier to list the things that don't contain asbestos than the things that do or could. So the things that don't contain asbestos are metal, wood, and glass. So everything else could possibly contain asbestos. As inspectors, we do sort of look at age of a building too. So if we're looking at something post 1990s, there's a tendency to have less of a chance of things having asbestos in them, but there still could be asbestos in those products. So we can't say for sure just because of a certain age that something doesn't have asbestos in it. So here are just some photos of asbestos-containing materials, and I just wanted to point out here is a window, and then there's window glazing tape. So you might not think about just this tape that's possibly containing, but it is. And then vinyl floor tile on top here, and then the mastic below. The mastic can be containing, and the vinyl floor tile above can be containing. This is just another example of vinyl floor tile. And this is under a carpet, so carpet glue can contain as well. So this is important for productions to know, because oftentimes people think, oh, I'm just ripping up carpet, or I'm just removing this floor. And they might not put any controls in place, where in fact you might be ripping up a whole bunch of friable sort of glue or something underneath the carpet. Also drywall joint compound. So I just wanted to give you another picture of drywall joint compound, because this is probably a better one. So drywall joint compound is used to fill in the gap between two pieces of drywall. So when the drywall goes up, it's unfinished. You want a flat surface on which to paint. So then the drywall joint compound, or mud as it's called, is used to sort of smooth out the surface. So this can be containing. And why does that matter for productions? Well, it doesn't normally if it's covered, but if you're going to impact that drywall in some way, if you're going to cut it or drill into it or do something, remove it, then you need to know what you're dealing with. Asbestos containing surface materials can also be things like textured sealing coat or textured wall coating. In fact, you've probably seen this before. It's better known as popcorn sealing. So actually, I have a popcorn ceiling, and it's fine if it's intact and it's painted and no one touches it. But when I was a kid, I used to. I have two siblings. I used to get mad at my siblings, and I used to take a broom and I used to bang on the ceiling to shut them up upstairs, because they were loud. And so that was probably not the greatest thing to do on a popcorn ceiling at the time, because then I could see actually the flakes kind of falling off the ceiling. So I didn't know anything about asbestos back then, and now in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have done that. And then here, this is sprayed applied fireproofing on an I-beam up top near the metal Q-deck ceiling. This was often used, so they used it for fireproofing purposes. So in a production, this might be very important, because I do know that productions need to go up close to the roof. They're doing some rigging. They do hanging lights and things like that up there. So if there is a sprayed applied fireproofing on anything up near your ceiling, you need to be aware of that and control for that. Then there's thermal systems. Boiler systems can have asbestos, pipe lagging, pipe wrap. You can see here, this is really poor condition wrap, and that might be something you need to deal with if you're going to be in and around that type of this room. So other miscellaneous asbestos containing products, we talked about vinyl floor tile, et cetera already. This is a roof. So the asphaltic roofs can have them. Actually, all layers can have them on a roof. The underside of a sink can have them. So this coating can have asbestos in it, and that's actually for noise insulative purposes. The HVAC duct mastic is right here, this red mastic. Oftentimes when we see this red mastic, we're very suspicious, because it comes up a lot of times that it is containing. This is putty that's put in cable penetrations. So this is just a cable, and they put all this putty in there to insulate that and to cover the duct. So that has come back quite a few times containing. This is vermiculite that's coming into this bag. It's a little bit hard to see, but it looks like kitty litter. And so this is a concrete masonry wall that's there, and they've taped a bag there so it catches the vermiculite, because we're actually sampling for it there. But essentially, it's really important when we see this type of concrete masonry wall that we don't puncture it. It's fine if it's intact and there's no holes in it, but if you're planning to hang something on there, or you're planning to do something and somehow impact that wall, what you'll get is a bunch of vermiculite just pouring out of that wall. And it's hollow blocks that are connected. So you'll get you'll just get tons of vermiculite just coming out. And once that happens, that is a high risk exposure situation. So we don't want that to happen. So if you can recognize the concrete masonry walls ahead of time and just don't impact them, then you'll save yourself a lot of trouble. This is actually a carpet tile underneath carpet. So the carpet is not containing, but the tile underneath is. So again, as I was saying before, something you think is fairly innocuous, you're just going to tear up some carpet and put in some new carpet. If you don't know any information about that carpet or what's underneath it, then you could be causing a high risk exposure situation as well. We're going to move on to an inorganic lead now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about health effects and identification. And the reason why I say inorganic lead is because organic lead is a bit of a different animal. I remember when I was a child, and I don't know if people in the audience remember this, but there was organic lead, tetramethyl and tetraethyl lead, used in gasoline as an anti-knock agent. So I remember going up to the pump when I was a kid with my dad's car that took leaded gasoline, and we would get leaded gasoline to put in the vehicle, and this wreaked a bunch of havoc on our environment, etc. But they banned it in the late 70s. We're not really discussing that. We're going to talk about other things which you're more familiar with, things like paints and coatings. So inorganic lead, it's a heavy metal, it's soft and malleable, and that makes it really useful for certain things like solder, for instance, and also making things flexible. So lead has been put in things like extension cords or just cords in general, like your computer cords, any kind of electrical cord, because it makes the plastic malleable. It's commonly used. It was used historically and currently. People think that we don't use lead anymore. We still use lead. So the routes of entry, again, there's inhalation that's important of the dust and things that we disturb, but people don't really think about it. But ingestion is actually one of the most important routes of entry for lead. And we think, oh, as adults, we're not ingesting the lead. But you could, right? If you're touching a bunch of things and you're not washing your hands, or you're eating in the environment where there's a bunch of lead-containing materials that are in poor condition, that sort of thing, you could possibly be ingesting it from hand to mouth. Absorption through the skin is less likely for the inorganic, but more likely for the organic lead. 90% of the body's lead burden is actually stored in your bones, but some of it can be stored in your liver and your kidneys. And it really disrupts a whole bunch of systems in your body. The nervous system, the reproductive system, the digestive system, muscular system. And it's a probable human carcinogen as well. So what's it in? I think most of us know we can find it in paint and coatings and primers, that sort of thing. And you can still find it in some of these. And people think we don't use it in paint anymore, but in industrial paints, we still use them quite commonly. So for steel, for chips, things like that. Ceramic tile glaze can be lead containing as well. And this probably doesn't impact production so much unless you're doing some demolition of some tile. Piping can contain solder joints as well. And you might wonder, well, why do I care about the piping? A lot of our piping in Vancouver is really old. Our water mains are really old, and they can have lead in them. So we've seen it with drinking water having elevated levels of lead. And you might think, oh, well, most productions don't actually use the potable water as a drinking water source, so it's not really an issue. But if you were to do that, you'd probably want to look into whether you're having lead exposure from your drinking water as well. So lead paint on like steel beams and rafters and things like that are quite important in the film industry because, like I was saying before, there's a lot of rigging that occurs on these rafters and beams. And so if there's leaded paint there, you'd want to know. And if there's a lot of like dust on those rafters, that dust can contain a bunch of lead in it. If there was leaded paint there, it can contain other things as well, other contaminants too. So just if you're working around that type of environment, just being aware of the hazards that are there before doing that rigging work. And then these are just some pictures of really poor condition lead paint. And so even if you're not planning to physically impact these areas, you probably need to do something. You do need to do something about these areas before you inhabit that space, because this flaky paint is falling down and it's getting all over the floor. And you wouldn't want to be just working in there without doing something in that environment. So you could remove the paint. There's various methods to remove paint. I know productions themselves normally don't do the paint removal, but if you were to do that, you would need an exposure control plan and training and safe work procedures. And there's different ways of removing paint. So there's a chemical way. You could chemically strip the paint, but then there's a chemical that you need to be dealing with. Hand tools, there's power tools. Each of these would have sort of different risk levels for the actual removal and would need certain safe work procedures in place according to that risk. There's also this new method with lasers too. So that's a fairly new one. I haven't seen too much, but it does clean the surface quite well. So what can a production company do in terms of asbestos-containing materials or lead-containing materials? Well, if you need to impact those materials, or if they're in really bad condition, you can have a third-party qualified contractor come in to take samples to confirm, just make sure that it is or isn't. Or if you think, I'd rather just treat it as containing and just hire an abatement firm to remove it, that's a viable option as well. Sometimes timing or scheduling dictates what's done, because a production oftentimes doesn't have time to, especially if they've already started work, which happens quite a bit. They might not have time to bring in someone to take samples, to get the lab analyses, to get the reporting done. And then if it is containing, then hire an abatement contractor and remove it, et cetera, before they have to use the building. So sometimes they jump straight to the treating as containing and dealing with it. Other times they're like, you know what, it's so much, or it's not worthwhile. We're not going to go into this location. So that's an option. Or they say, it's only that area that's affected. We're just going to cordon it off and either encapsulate it or just kind of just make sure no one comes into contact with that area and just not use it. So that's another option that production companies can do. So we're also going to talk a little bit about other hazardous building materials here. Mercury, polychlorinated biphenyls, and ozone depleting substances. These are less commonly known and less commonly dealt with productions, but I just wanted to alert you to some of these hazards that could be possible in some of these sites. So mercury is a liquid metal, and it's the only metal that is liquid at room temperature, and it's quite toxic to humans. So when I was in school, a couple stories helped me really solidify and remember what the toxicity, the toxicological properties of mercury were. And so you see this picture here of the person in the hat. So there's this term, mad as a hatter. You've probably heard of it before. And it stems from people used to use mercury to make hats. It was part of the process of making felt. And then they would wear the hats. And the people who wore these hats for long periods of time, they would become mad. So they'd have neurological problems. They'd have, they'd become insane. So it does have, mercury has these neurological effects, and it can cause tremors and memory loss. And it also can affect other parts of the system too, the lungs and digestive system, et cetera. There's another story I distinctly remember of lighthouse keepers who used to, work alone in these lighthouses, and they'd have a mercury bath in the middle of their lighthouse to serve as a mirror for the lights, because in the old days that they needed something more to reflect the light. And so they used these mercury baths, and they'd sit with them all day, every day, living with this mercury bath that was slowly vaporizing into the air. And then the lighthouse keepers would also become mad. And at the time, people suspected that it was the loneliness. People were stuck there for months at a time by themselves, and that probably didn't help. But then later on, they realized, this mercury was probably causing a lot of these problems. So where is mercury in a building? Well, we know that, we use them in thermometers, and the liquid nature of the metal makes it useful for that. They're used in thermostats. So you can see here, I don't know if you see this glass here, but these are glass vials of mercury. They're also in your lights. So fluorescent light tubes have them. High intensity discharge lamps have them. Even compact fluorescent lights, the newer lights, do have them. So what does that matter, really? Because they're in the lights. It's not a big deal. If they're inside the lights, if they're inside your thermostat, it's not going to be an issue. It's when you break them. So let's say there's going to be a lot of change out of lights. If you break them, you should have some kind of plan as to what to do. So you would want to have some kind of safe work procedure and spill response plan for something like that. That's probably when you'd need to worry about it as a production. Polychlorinated biphenyls. They're a group of a couple hundred chemicals that are also very resistant to degradation, and they're really good at being heat resistant and electrically resistant. Same sort of properties that we love in asbestos in a liquid form. So this fact that it persists is great for some things, but then again, it bioaccumulates in fish and animal tissue. It's a class 1 carcinogen, meaning it is a known human carcinogen. And then it can also cause issues with children and their development, especially as a fetus. Where do we find PCBs? Well, you can find them in the lights again. So light ballasts can contain them. And so here is a fluorescent light arrangement here, and this is a ballast inside it, and it controls voltage. And they will have PCB oil inside them. Because again, they're good with heat. It's electrically and heat resistant. So before 1979, there's a good chance that your light ballasts will have them. Between 79 and 98, it'll say no PCBs if it doesn't have them. So I'm going to just switch to my magnifying glass here, so you can see. I hope you can see. It says non-PCB in red here. And then they also can be found in transformers. So you're thinking, well, why do I need to worry about transformers? Well, we were involved in one production where they were going into an old substation, and they had transformers in that facility before. And then they had taken out all the equipment, but there was still leftover oil on the ground. And that oil was PCB containing because it used to be a substation. So just being aware and looking for things like that on location. Ozone depleting substances. These are your fluorocarbons, your hydrofluorocarbons, your chlorocarbons and halons. They're non-combustible liquids used in refrigerants, as aerosol propellants, and in cleaning products. ODS in real life. You can find them inside HVAC units. So this is a air handling unit on a rooftop, and there's a nameplate that will tell you that there is what kind of refrigerant there is, and then you can look up the refrigerant. So this one is really hard to see, but I'll tell you it's a 410A, and you can look that up and see whether it contains these, what kind of CFCs they contain. And ODS here in another type of air conditioning system. Again, it's the same refrigerant that's being used, but you can look and actually read the nameplate and get information about it. And then again, just another example, it's a different refrigerant there. But also fire extinguishers can contain ODS, the halon ones that are used for fighting fuel fires. So, you're exposing the environment to ODS using that, of course. The fire is more important to fight at that point. So what can a production company do? For intact equipment, PCBs and ODS really shouldn't pose an exposure risk. However, if you're going to be removing anything, any HVAC equipment, et cetera, then you need to be aware of that, or refrigerators for that matter, and looking for PCB spills. if there are transformers or previous electrical equipment that might be spilling PCBs, just being aware of that. So now we're going to go to a little exercise, and I'm going to open the chat. So what we're going to do is just look at this room. This is like a very typical office environment. And I want you to take what you just learned earlier and just apply that here and tell me, what material are you seeing that could be possibly a hazardous material, and say what it is. So if you say, X, the window, for instance, and then like asbestos. So if you could give me a few examples that in the chat, we can chat about that afterwards. So I'll give you a couple minutes to, I'm seeing some already. Yeah, so ceiling tiles, definitely. Ceiling tiles, mercury in the fluorescent light bulbs. Yeah, very good. I'm just going to wait a couple minutes for people to get their ideas in. Okay. Any other ideas? I can fire gear. Yeah. Paint. Yeah. Is it lead based? Great. I think, oops. Yeah, so we got the fluorescent bulbs with mercury, but also the light ballasts with PCBs. Window putty, yeah, window putty asbestos in the floor copper tiles and the drywall seams. Great, very good. So we talked about the acoustic ceiling tiles. When the window glazing tape can also contain it, or any kind of putties or caulking around there can contain. Mercury in the wall thermostat, that's great. We talked about the carpet and underneath it. Mercury in the thermostat. Really good, guys. Very, very good. I didn't mention this before, but the cove base can be containing, and behind it, the mastic can be containing asbestos as well. So that's great. And we talked about the lead, possible lead paint. Oh, sorry. And the drywall joint compound. And also behind or above the ceiling tile, there could be HVAC ducting or anything, actually. So looking for mastics and things like that above the ceiling tile as well. So very good, everyone. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to move on to silica. So what is silica? It's a naturally occurring mineral. It's the most common hazard on a work site. There's two forms, the amorphous form, which we're not so worried about. That's glass and silica gel, those sorts of things. But crystalline silica is what we're most concerned with. And it's really in anything that's coming from the ground. So coal and sand and shale and stone, all those things will have silica, or crystalline silica in it. And there's three forms, quartz, cristabalite, and tridymite. And quartz is the most common. So where is it found? It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Really, it's found in soil, sand, rocks. It's contained in products such as concrete and mortar and cinder blocks, stone, stucco, bricks, asphalt, and drywall. So where is it? What kind of industries is it found in? Pretty much everywhere, including the film industry. So how does this exposure occur? It occurs when you disturb it or impact it by grinding or sanding or cutting or chipping. Any of those sorts of activities, even sweeping, can cause exposure to occur. And what we're really worried about is the smaller sized silica particles, the ones that we call respirable. So they are the fine ones that get down into the deeper lung. And the reason why we're concerned about them is because it can have respiratory health effects, lung cancer again. Also, there's an increased risk if you're a smoker. And silicosis is another respiratory disease, which is very similar to asbestosis in many ways. It's a fibrosis of the lung that happens. And you can present with no initial symptoms, but over time can become breathless, etc., and have chest pains. And it can be fatal as well. So this is an example of a healthy lung compared to a silicosis lung. So what can a production company do? It's a little bit different from asbestos and lead in that you probably wouldn't, no one would remediate the silica. What they would do is they would have a plan, a control plan around dealing with the silica and some safe work procedures. They would have training around it, and they would be controlling that dust. So that's what people should do in that situation, because you're not going to be removing all the concrete, you know, in a building like you might in asbestos and lead. So the next topic is mold, and this is one of my most favorite topics. I used to be a microbiologist, so so for me, kind of melding the two worlds, my industrial hygiene world and my microbiology world, is really interesting to me. So just a quick introduction to microorganisms. We have bacteria and fungi. We're not going to talk about the viruses here, but usually when you find bacteria, and you'll find bacteria and fungi together, and fungi are molds. We don't tend to sample for the bacteria, although when I was first starting out, we used to do both of those things, but we tend to just use mold, and it's an indicator that there would be some bacteria as well in that environment. So these microorganisms are everywhere in our indoor and outdoor environment. Humans are exposed all the time, but under certain conditions, we can have some certain health effects. So what's required for mold growth? We're just going to concentrate on mold from here on out. You need food of some sort, so anything organic. So drywall, paints, flooring, insulation, all those things can serve as food for mold. The right temperature is pretty much any kind of indoor environment would be at a right temperature for mold growth to occur. So the only thing that can be really controlled is water. So we try not to let water come into an indoor environment when we don't want it. So how can you be exposed? Ingestion is one way, and there have been many accounts of people eating moldy hay and moldy rice and dying from them, or getting liver cancer if they do it over a period of time. That's really probably not the main route of exposure in a production setting. Dermal contact is for people who are dealing with moldy substances, or like compost and things like that on a day-to-day basis. There could be dermatitis and other types of skin disease. But inhalation is going to be the most important. So the spores that come into the air, the molds will have, they'll have like branched filaments, like a tree almost, and then they'll have these little round spores that are sort of reproductive. They release into the air, and then they go somewhere else, and then they grow. So both of those things can be breathed in, as well as mycotoxins. And these are substances that molds will produce to actually compete with other molds and bacteria. They want their own space, so they produce these mycotoxins. They'll get away. And so these are great at killing other organisms so that they can stay and grow themselves, but they're also very toxic to humans. So what kind of health effects can occur? So there can be systemic fungal infections, and these affect people who are more immunocompromised. So we've seen cases of this where there's like fungal balls that grow in the lung, and then people have trouble breathing, and then they can actually die from some of these systemic fungal infections. But again, mostly immunocompromised folks that would get those. There can be allergic reactions. Actually, I'm allergic to mold. I used to do so much mold work that I believe I've got sensitized to it over time. So I'm allergic. You can get irritant and non-allergic reactions. Back to the allergic effects. So exacerbation of asthma, you can get that. You can also, there's more and more evidence towards developing asthma with long-term exposure. Then there's also irritant and non-allergic reactions, and the toxic type effects dealing with the, to do with the mycotoxins that are produced. So how do we identify mold? The most important thing is visual inspection. So a lot of people think, oh, I want to sample. But really look to identify areas of mold growth, but water intrusion as well. So looking for water staining. Anywhere there's water that's come in, if it's been more than 24 to 72 hours, there likely had been growth and maybe it stopped because there's no more water, or it's still growing. So just looking for areas where there might be water coming in from penetrations, looking for things that aren't sealed properly on the outside. So when you do a mold investigation, you want to be able to look at inside and outside of that building, looking at that building envelope integrity. Airborne relative humidity levels are important too. So if you do see, really high relative humidity, over 60% consistently, there could be a possible condensation that's happening on walls, and then you could have condensation mold. The moisture content of the building materials is important too, but likely productions won't have their own meter like this one that shows the actual moisture content of a wall material, but for people who are doing inspections, it's really important. Presence of standing water, looking for that outside. Oftentimes you'll see that the building envelope might be not built properly, such that things are draining into the wall. So looking for things like that. So this is just a picture of a window that has had some water coming in. And so one of the first things I'll do when I look at a building is I'll go straight to the window. If you ever see me do an inspection, I'll just run straight to the window, because that's the area where there's a big penetration that was then sealed in some way. And a lot of times that seal fails. So you'll be able to see that. I oftentimes will look right underneath the window on that exterior wall behind the cove base, if I can get to it, because water will travel down. So anything that leaked through will automatically start to make its way down to the ground. And then even if, let's say, I've had owners, property owners, paint over water staining on drywall or paint over mold and things like that. Even if they do something like that, if you lift up the cove base molding, usually they haven't gotten there yet, and you'll see this nice healthy layer of mold growth underneath that cove base where that water was trapped. So anyways, those are some telltale signs for me. And then looking, of course, at floor wall ceilings. The ceiling is really important because you'll see things coming from the roof and trickling down to the ceiling. This is just a picture of some mold inside a wall cavity, which probably in a production you wouldn't be accessing. So what can a production company do if there's suspect mold that's been identified? We really want to get an idea of how much mold there is, because most plans deal with how much mold there is, what square footage there is. And if it's a lot of mold in a location, you might consider just not using that location. And I know that a lot of productions want that sort of decrepit zombie look. And they're looking at, these old places that have a lot of water intrusion, a lot of issues with them because of the look of it. But it can pose such a risk that it's not worthwhile. So really consider that. You could have a third-party abatement contractor abate the moldy material. Again, it takes time. There's quite a bit of money that needs to go into that. And then you need to fix the problem. So that's oftentimes a sticking point, because you got to figure out where the water came from and then fix it so it doesn't happen again. And oftentimes with productions, they're saying, well, it's not my building. Why should I have to do that? And it becomes a bit of a sticking point. I have seen too people with small amounts of mold. They temporarily encapsulate that area or just don't allow people into that area. However, the problem with mold is it's not like asbestos and lead where it's in one area and you can sort of encapsulate it. With mold, sometimes it's hidden. So you might just see the mold in one area and just want to put plastic on top or whatever you want to do just to keep it there. But you might not be seeing the mold inside the wall that's all over the place. And those spores and those hyphal fragments are coming into the environment invisible to your naked eye. So I'm a little reluctant to say that last one, but I do know in certain circumstances that can work. But as a person who's done mold work for a really, really long time, it's not the best practice. And we want to get rid of the source. So there's also animal hazards that we see when we walk through locations. The animals themselves can be hazards. We've come across raccoons before, and so if they're not happy and they're protecting their young, they could get quite nasty. So yeah, they can bite, they can puncture, they can poison. So we need to be aware of those. But also they can leave things behind too that can cause disease or other types of effects. So this picture is above a ceiling tile. So this is a ceiling tile. It's above the ceiling tile in the plenum. And these are mouse droppings. Lots of them. And unfortunately, we see this more often, more often than not. And we're not going to say where we see them. The droppings themselves can carry disease. Also, urine. Urine can cause allergies. So rat and mouse urine antigen is some of the most allergenic antigens that we have. What can a production company do? Well, if you're seeing a lot of droppings or signs of animals in a building that you want to inhabit, contact the property owner, see what they can do to clean up the area and control the animals coming in. You might also hire a third-party abatement and animal control firm. And then once that's done, just ensuring that you're not attracting those animals anymore, storing food properly, removing food garbage, just making sure that you try to close off any penetrations, although animals can get into like really small holes, but closing off as much as you can potential pathways into the building. So I wonder if we have another, we don't have very much time. I'm just going to go over this and we're not going to go over the exercise, but this was another exercise now that you've gone through the rest of the presentation. And I just wanted to see if anyone thought of anything different in this type of example. I don't know if you can see this here, but this is staining. This is like black staining on the ceiling tile. And so likely there's some mold there as well. And I think there probably could be pests. It's a kitchen. That's what I was going to say too. I think if you were to lift that ceiling tile up right there, you would have some things dropping down on you. And there's refrigerator for refrigerants, the ODS, thermostats, same sort of things as we saw before. So I won't go too much into detail there. I did want to talk about this picture here. It just gives you a better close-up of the concrete masonry unit wall. And so this could have asbestos in the vermiculite inside, sprayed applied fireproofing here. And then even behind this foil and this fiberglass, which are not asbestos containing, there could be mastics behind there. So we can't just assume this thing is not containing. There might be things that we can't see behind it. So in summary, I just wanted to say that really identifying building-related hazardous materials is best done at the beginning. We've come in at all stages, and it's really not great when we come in once someone's been exposed. That's not the time we want to come in. If you can identify as locations managers and health and safety folks going out to do your first sort of location scouting, if you can identify some of the suspicious looking things, then you can have so many more options to you as to what to do next. And then you can comply with regulations and you can ensure the health and safety of all your workers. So I'm going to take some questions. I'd like to acknowledge Ankita and Mavis for helping with this presentation, as well as the online course that we offer. And then for more information, you can contact me. And also if you're interested in the course, there's the link here, and you can take it at your own leisure. And there's like there's an exam you have to pass in order to complete that course. So I will take any questions at this point in the Q&A, and thank you very much for listening today.
Yeah, thank you, Mona. That was amazing. And we need to start to introduce more and more this topic. I know hygiene is huge topic. Like you touch it a little bit, just to make sure everybody's aware of these most common ones, right? But hygiene is involved more, like noisy, vibration, and lots of things, right? Unfortunately, we don't have any questions here, but if you have any questions, you can email Mona as well, right, Mona? And then
yes, definitely. You can reach out to me. My email's right there. So please let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for joining today, I guess.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, it's an amazing topic. I think it is time to talk more and more about it. So we will wrap up then, and thank you so much again. And
Sure.
it's time for lunch and stretch break, sponsored by
Great.
Seta Protect. And enjoy your break, and we will see you back at 1 p.m.
Oh, Natalie, someone wants me to put the course link in the chat, so I was just going to do that right now, but I just have to figure out how to do that, if you don't mind.
Of
I'm
course.
just going to do that. Oops. Is that how I do it? I ask. Is that what it is? Oh, did that work?
I think people can copy and paste, maybe. Let's
Yeah, can you see it?
Okay. Do it, and then...
Or you can, if you go into the chat, Mona.
Yes. Oh, okay.
Down at the bottom, there's a little symbol of the attached files.
A little symbol of the attached files.
Down where it says type a message.
Oh yes. Send
So
a message.
Click on the paper clip.
Okay.
And then you can attach a file and drop it in directly.
Oh, I think they just wanted the link. So
you just want a link? I'm sorry. Okay.
I could copy and paste, and then it's working.
There we go. We got it.
Oh, I also did it in the chat, so that looks like a link too.
Yeah.
Everybody's got it.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
I'll stay in the room for a little bit if people want to approach me individually. Can I stay in the room?
Absolutely. We'll get to that right now.